Not all American Christians were taken with the revivals of the Second Great Awakening. The early 19th century also saw the rise of Unitarianism as a group of ministers and their followers came to reject aspects of Orthodox Protestant belief, including the divinity of Christ. Christians in New England were particularly involved in the debates surrounding Unitarianism, as Harvard University became a hotly contested center of cultural authority between Unitarians and Trinitarians. Unitarianism had important effects on the world of reform when a group of Unitarian ministers founded the Transcendental Club in 1836. The club met for 4 years and included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bronson Alcott, Frederick Henry Hedge, George Ripley, Orestes Brownson, James Freeman Clarke, and Theodore Parker. While initially limited to ministers or former ministers, except for the eccentric Alcott, the club quickly expanded to include numerous literary intellectuals. Among these were the author Henry David Thoreau, the proto-feminist and literary critic Margaret Fuller, and the educational reformer Elizabeth Peabody. Transcendentalism became a movement of writers and philosophers who were loosely bound together by adherence to an idealistic system of thought based on the belief in the essential supremacy of insight over logic and experience for the revelation of the deepest truths. Among the Transcendentalists' core beliefs was the inherent goodness of both man and nature. Transcendentalists believed that society and its institutions, particularly organized religion and political parties, ultimately corrupted the purity of the individual. They had faith that man is at his best when truly self-reliant and independent. It was believed that only from such real individuals could true community be formed. Rooted in the transcendental philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and of German idealism more generally, the movement developed as a reaction against 18th century rationalism, John Locke's philosophy of sensualism, and the manifest destiny of New England Calvinism. Its fundamental belief was in the unity and immanence of God in the world. The publication of Ralph Waldo Emerson's 1836 essay Nature is usually considered the watershed moment at which Transcendentalism became a major cultural movement. Emerson closed the essay by calling for a revolution in human consciousness to emerge from the new idealist philosophy. In the same year, on September 8th, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Transcendentalism became a coherent movement with the founding of the Transcendental Club that I mentioned previously. It was founded by prominent New England intellectuals. From 1840, the group published frequently in its journal The Dial and other venues. Early in the movement's history, critics used the term transcendentalist as a pejorative and suggested that the members' position was beyond sanity and reason. Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American essayist, lecturer, and poet, was seen as a champion of individualism and a prescient critic of the countervailing pressures of society. He disseminated his thoughts through dozens of published essays and more than 1,500 public lectures across the United States. Emerson gradually moved away from the religious and social beliefs of his contemporaries, formulating and expressing the philosophy of transcendentalism in his 1836 essay Nature. Following this groundbreaking work, he gave a speech entitled The American Scholar in 1837. Emerson's first two collections of essays, published in 1841 and 1844, represent the core of his thinking. His work includes such well-known essays as Self-Reliance, The Oversoul, Circles, The Poet, and Experience. Together with Nature, these essays made the decade from the mid-1830s to the mid-1840s Emerson's most fertile period. Emerson wrote on a number of subjects, never espousing fixed philosophical tenets, but developing certain ideas and themes such as individuality, freedom, humankind's ability to realize almost anything, and the relationship between the soul and the surrounding world. While his writing style can be seen as somewhat impenetrable, Emerson's essays remain among the linchpins of American thinking and have greatly influenced the thinkers, writers, and poets who have followed him. Henry David Thoreau was an American author, poet, philosopher, abolitionist, naturalist, tax resister, development critic, surveyor, historian, and leading transcendentalist. He is best known for his book Walden, a reflection upon simple living in natural surroundings, and his essay Civil Disobedience, an argument for individual resistance to civil government in moral opposition to an unjust state. Among Thoreau's lasting contributions were his writings on natural history and philosophy, in which he anticipated the methods and findings of ecology and environmental history, two sources of modern-day environmentalism. His literary style interweaves close natural observation, personal experience, pointed rhetoric, symbolic meanings, and historical lore. He was also deeply interested in the idea of survival in the face of hostile elements, historical change, and natural decay. At the same time, he advocated abandoning waste and illusion in order to discover life's true essential needs. He was a lifelong abolitionist, delivering lectures that attacked the fugitive slave law while praising the writings of Wendell Phillips and defending abolitionist John Brown. Thoreau's philosophy of civil disobedience later influenced the political thoughts and actions of such notable figures as Leo Tolstoy, Mohandas Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. In the era of revivalism and reform, Americans understood the family and home as the hearthstones of civic virtue and moral influence. This increasingly confined middle-class white women to the domestic sphere, where they were responsible for educating children and maintaining household virtue. Yet women took the very ideology that defined their place in the home and managed to use it to fashion a public role for themselves. As a result, women actually became more visible and active in the public sphere than ever before. The influence of the Second Great Awakening, coupled with new educational opportunities available to girls and young women, enabled white middle-class women to leave their homes en masse, joining and forming societies dedicated to everything from literary interests to the anti-slavery movement. In the early 19th century, the dominant understanding of gender claimed that women were the guardians of virtue and the spiritual heads of the home. Women were expected to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic, and to pass these virtues on to their children. Historians have described these expectations as the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood, as they developed in tandem with industrialization, the market revolution, and the Second Great Awakening. These economic and religious transformations increasingly seem to divide the world into the public space of work and politics and the domestic space of leisure and morality. Voluntary work, related to labor laws, prison reform, and anti-slavery, applied women's roles as guardians of moral virtue to address all forms of social issues that they felt contributed to the moral decline of society. In spite of this apparent valuation of women's position in society, there were clear limitations. Under the terms of coverture, men gained legal control of their wives' property, and women with children had no legal rights over their offspring. Additionally, women could not initiate divorce, make wills, sign contracts, or vote. Women's education provides an example of the great strides made by and for women during the antebellum period. As part of a larger education reform movement in the early Republic, several female reformers worked tirelessly to increase women's access to education. They argued that if women were to take charge of the education of their children, they needed to be well educated themselves. While the women's education movement did not generally push for women's political or social equality, it did assert women's intellectual equality with men, an idea that would eventually have important effects. Educators such as Emma Willard, Catherine Beecher, and Mary Lyon, founders of the Troy Female Seminary, Hartford Female Seminary, and Mount Holyoke Seminary, respectively, adopted the same rigorous curriculum that was used for boys. Many of these schools have the particular goal of training women to be teachers. Many graduates of these prominent seminaries would found their own schools, spreading women's education across the country, and with it, ideas about women's potential to take part in public life. The abolitionist movement was another important school for women's public engagement. Many of the earliest women's rights advocates began their activism by fighting the injustices of slavery, including Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony. In the 1830s, women in cities such as Boston, New York, and Philadelphia established female societies dedicated to the anti-slavery cause. Initially, these societies were similar to the prayer and fundraising-based projects of other reform societies. As such societies proliferated, however, their strategies changed. Women could not vote, for example, but they increasingly used their rights to petition to express their anti-slavery grievances to the government. Impassioned women like the Grimke sisters even began to travel on lecture circuits. This latter strategy, born of fervent anti-slavery advocacy, ultimately tethered the cause of women's rights to abolitionism. Sarah Moore Grimke and Angelina Emily Grimke were born to a wealthy family in Charleston, South Carolina, where they witnessed the horrors of slavery firsthand. Repulsed by the treatment of the enslaved laborers on the Grimke plantation, they decided to support the anti-slavery movement by sharing their experience on Northern lecture tours. At first speaking to female audiences, they soon attracted promiscuous crowds of both men and women. They were among the earliest and most famous American women to take such a public role in the name of reform. When the Grimke sisters met substantial harassment and opposition to their public speaking on anti-slavery, they were inspired to speak out against more than the slave system. They began to see that they would need to fight for women's rights in order to fight for the rights of enslaved people. Other female abolitionists soon joined them in linking the issues of women's rights and abolitionism by drawing direct comparisons between the condition of free women in the United States and the condition of the slave. As the anti-slavery movement gained momentum in northern states in the 1830s and 40s, so too did efforts for women's rights. These efforts came to a head at an event that took place in London in 1840. That year, Lucretia Mott was among the American delegates attending the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Because of ideological disagreements between some of the abolitionists, the convention's organizers refused to seat the female delegates or allow them to vote during the proceedings. Angered by such treatment, Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose husband was also a delegate, returned to the United States with a renewed interest in pursuing women's rights. In 1848, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention, a two-day summit in New York State in which women's rights advocates came together to discuss the problems facing women. Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments for the Seneca Falls Convention to capture the wide range of issues embraced by the early women's rights movement. She modeled the document on the Declaration of Independence to make explicit the connection between women's liberty and the rhetoric of America's founding. The Declaration of Sentiments outlined 15 grievances and 11 resolutions. They championed property rights, access to the professions, and most controversially, the right to vote. 68 women and 32 men, all of whom were already involved in some aspect of reform, signed the Declaration of Sentiments. Another advocate of women's rights was Lucy Stone. In 1850, she met with Paulina Kellogg Wright Davis, Abby Kelly Foster, William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and 6 other women to organize the larger National Women's Rights Convention. This national convention brought together for the first time many of those who had been working individually for women's rights. On the closing day, Stone gave a stirring speech to the 1,000-strong audience, which is said to have inspired Susan B. Anthony to join the cause. While conventions provided places where women could support each other, they also highlighted some of the challenges of unifying many different leaders into one movement. Women's rights activists faced difficult questions such as, should the movement include or exclude men? Who was to blame for women's inequality? What remedies should they seek? How could women best convince others of their need for equality? One goal, however, was clear. Attendees resolved to secure legal and social equality for women on par with men. By 1860, women's rights advocates had made some headway. In Indiana, divorces could be granted not only on the basis of adultery, but also on desertion, drunkenness, and cruelty. In New York, Indiana, Maine, Missouri, and Ohio, women's property rights had expanded to allow married women to keep their own wages. In 1860, New York passed a revised Married Women's Property Act, which gave women shared ownership of their children, allowing them to have a say in their children's wills and wages, and granting them the right to inherit property. The movement experienced further advances and setbacks in New York and other states, but feminists were able to use each new win as an example to apply more leverage on unyielding legislative bodies. Clearly, there was still much to be done. However, reformers had given a name to the women's oppression and had set into motion the movement that would continue to change American attitudes for years to come.